The Unit 731 routinely conducted tests on people who were dehumanized and internally referred to as logs. The experiments included disease injections, controlled dehydration, biological weapons testing, hypobaric pressure chamber experiments, vivisection, organ harvesting, amputation, and standard weapon testing. The victims included not only kidnapped men, women, and children, but also babies born from systemic rape perpetrated by the staff within the complex. The victims also came from different nationalities, the majority being Chinese, with a significant Russian minority. In addition, Unit 731 produced biological weapons that were used in areas of China not occupied by Japanese forces, including Chinese cities and villages, water sources, and fields. In the final moments of World War II, all prisoners were killed to conceal the evidence. There were no survivors. When we approach the subject of World War II, the Holocaust is widely mentioned for obvious reasons, and the average citizen has at least a small notion of what happened. But the West knows very little about the atrocities that occurred in East Asia. World War II devastated the lives of over 100 million people around the globe. And of all the areas in which World War II was fought, none were as active as what would become known as the Pacific Theater. In fact, Japan arguably began the war by attacking Manchuria in 1931 and waged an undeniable war with China by invading it in 1937. The turmoil and upheaval caused by these invasions shook China to its foundations, triggered a civil war, and a famine that likely killed more people than currently live in Canada and Australia combined, lasting until the Soviet liberation of the country in 1945. And of all the atrocities that Imperial Japan unleashed upon the Chinese people during this brutal occupation, none was perhaps as gratuitously hateful as the operations of Unit 731, the Japanese biological warfare unit that somehow managed to dive even deeper into horror in what was already a genocidal war. Despite its innocent beginnings as a research and public health agency, Unit 731 ultimately became an assembly line for weaponized diseases that, if fully deployed, could have killed everyone on Earth several times over. All that progress was, of course, built upon the boundless suffering of human captives who were kept as guinea pigs and walking disease incubators until Unit 731 was shut down at the end of the war. But before Unit 731 was dismantled in 1945, it conducted some of the most torturous human experiments in recorded history. 21st century Japan bears no resemblance to the Japan of the 1940s, just as modern Germany does not resemble the Nazi era. Nevertheless, it is a fact that the Japanese during World War II committed horrific crimes. Terrible atrocities have occurred in nearly every nation and culture throughout history. They happen most often when they are ordered and encouraged by a country's leadership. Unfortunately, one of history's harsh lessons is that many people will become true beasts and monsters when they are encouraged to do so, or when they know they will not face legal consequences for their actions, at least not from their own government. Japan's history is marked by a remarkable transformation, from an isolated, time-frozen nation to a modern industrial power. Until the 19th century, the country was ruled by military leaders, the shoguns, who imposed strict isolation, allowing foreigners to enter only a small island. Everything changed when U.S. naval officer Matthew C. Perry forced Japan to open up to international trade in 1853–54. Determined to avoid foreign domination, the Japanese strove to modernize the country rapidly and prevent what was happening to China, which was being subjugated by European nations through unequal treaties and territorial concessions. With Emperor Meiji assuming executive power in 1871, the shoguns lost influence, and Japan embarked on a rapid process of industrialization and military modernization. Surprising the world, Japan won wars against China and the Russian Empire, consolidating its position as a respected power. However, Japan's growing influence and its pursuit of equality in international negotiations led to tensions with Western powers, who viewed Japan as a threat to their colonial interests in Asia. During World War I, Japan allied with the Allies and obtained some German possessions in the Pacific. Yet many Japanese still felt disrespected by Western powers and saw the civilian government as inefficient. This fueled a sense of Japanese ethnic superiority and led the country to become a fascist military dictatorship in the 1930s and 1940s. The Japanese militarist ideology, promoted through the media and education, preached blind obedience to the emperor, a modified version of samurai principles, and contempt for other cultures. During World War II, Japan inflicted horrors upon China, influenced by Japanese ethnocentrism, which viewed the Chinese people as inferior and worthless. This expansionist and imperialist mindset resulted in dire consequences during World War II, with China being one of the main targets of Japanese aggression. The atrocities committed by Japanese forces in China stand as witnesses to how extremist ideology and ethnocentrism can lead to humanitarian disasters. In 1931, Japan seized the Chinese territory of Manchuria, and in 1936, invaded China. One brutal atrocity followed another, the most infamous being the rape of Nanking in 1937. The country became a vast human laboratory, where people were subjected not only to modern warfare, but were also used as test subjects by the Japanese military to study chemical and biological weapons. The war itself cost millions of lives in China. Estimates of Chinese losses between 1936 and 1945 range from 15 to 20 million people, both military and civilian. And one of the individuals responsible for increasing that death toll was a monster named Shiro Ishii. Ishii, like Mengele and Auschwitz, was a doctor. Born in 1892 into a well-established middle-class family, he became a physician in 1921 and joined the army as a surgeon. Ishii was fascinated by the process of infection, and after a trip to the battlefields of World War I in Europe, he became interested in the possibilities of chemical and biological weapons. After spending 2 years on the battlefields of the First World War and talking with doctors and officers who had fought there, Ishii was recognized as an expert in the field of weapons of mass destruction. In 1936, Dr. Shiro Ishii was ordered to form a new Japanese military unit, officially called the No. 731 Water Purification Unit. It became known as Unit 731. Ishii was joined by other doctors, including his second-in-command, Dr. Hisato Yoshimura, and a team of assistants. The base of Unit 731 was an old fortress and prisoner-of-war camp located near the Chinese city of Harbin, where up to 1,000 people could be housed at once. Throughout its existence, which lasted until the end of the war, it is estimated that Unit 731 killed between 200,000 and 300,000 people. Most of the victims were not killed by firing squad or hanging, as was common in executions, but rather through macabre medical experiments. The victims were subjected to a variety of lethal experiments developed by Ishii, Yoshimura, and other members of the unit. Let's look at some of the main ones. Yoshimura Hisato, a physiologist associated with Unit 731, was particularly dedicated to the study of hypothermia. As part of the research led by Dr. Maruta on limb injuries, Hisato regularly carried out a practice in which he immersed prisoners' limbs in a bathtub filled with ice water, keeping them submerged until the arms or legs were frozen and a layer of ice formed over the skin. According to eyewitness testimony, the limbs produced a sound similar to that of a wooden plank when struck with a stick. Next, Hisato experimented with different methods for rapidly rewarming the frozen appendages. Sometimes he performed this procedure by pouring hot water over the limb. On other occasions, he brought it close to a fire, and in some cases, he left the subject untreated overnight to observe how long it would take for the person's own blood to thaw the limb. At first, these patients were volunteers from the army ranks, but when the experiments reached the limits of what could be observed non-invasively, and the supply of volunteers dried up, the unit turned to studying Chinese prisoners of war and civilian prisoners. And as the concept of consent went out the window, so did the restraint of the researchers. It was around this time that Unit 731 began referring to confined research subjects as logs, or maruta in Japanese. The study methods in these experiments were barbaric. Vivisection, for example, is the practice of mutilating human bodies without anesthesia to study the functioning of living systems. Thousands of men and women, mostly Chinese communist captives, children, and elderly farmers, were infected with diseases such as cholera and plague, and then had their organs removed for examination before dying in order to study the effects of the disease without the decomposition that occurs after death. Individuals had limbs amputated and reattached to the opposite side of the body, while others had their limbs crushed or frozen, or their circulation cut off to observe the progress of gangrene. Finally, when a prisoner's body was completely exhausted, they were usually shot or killed by lethal injection, although some may have been buried alive. None of the Chinese, Mongolian, Korean, or Russian captives assigned to Unit 731 survived their confinement. The effectiveness of various weapons was of obvious interest to the Japanese army. To determine effectiveness, Unit 731 gathered captives in a shooting range and fired at them from various distances using several Japanese weapons, such as the Nambu 8mm pistol, machine guns, and grenades. Wound patterns and penetration depths were then compared on the bodies of the dead and dying prisoners. Bayonets, swords, and knives were also studied in this way, although victims were generally designated for these tests. Flamethrowers were also tested, both on covered and exposed skin. In addition, gas chambers were installed in the unit's facilities, and test subjects were exposed to nerve gases and blister agents. Heavy objects were dropped on bound victims to study crushing injuries. Individuals were locked up and deprived of food and water to determine how long humans could survive without them, and victims were allowed to drink only seawater or were injected with incompatible human or animal blood to study transfusions and the clotting process. Meanwhile, prolonged exposure to X-rays sterilized and killed thousands of research participants, as well as caused horrific burns when the emitting plates were miscalibrated or held too close to participants' nipples, genitals, or faces. And to study the effects of high G-forces on pilots and parachutists in free fall, Unit 731 personnel loaded human beings into large centrifuges and spun them at increasingly higher speeds until they lost consciousness and/or died, which generally occurred around 10 to 15 Gs, although small children showed a lower tolerance to acceleration forces. To learn what they needed to know, the doctors assigned to Unit 731 infected victims with disease and withheld treatment to observe the uninterrupted course of the illness. A contemporary treatment, a primitive chemotherapy agent called salvarsan, was sometimes administered over a period of months to observe the side effects. To ensure effective transmission of the disease, male syphilitic victims were forced to violate their fellow female and male captives, who were then monitored to observe the onset of the disease. If the first exposure failed to establish infection, more rapes were arranged until it did. In addition to the syphilis experiments, rape became a common feature of Unit 731's experiments. For example, female captives of childbearing age were sometimes forcibly impregnated so that weapons and trauma experiments could be conducted on them. After being infected with various diseases, exposed to chemical weapons, or suffering crushing injuries, gunshot wounds, and shrapnel wounds, the pregnant test subjects were dissected and the effects on the fetuses were studied. The idea seems to have been to translate the team's findings into civilian medicine. But if the researchers of Unit 731 ever published these results, the papers appear not to have survived the war years. The entirety of Unit 731's research supported its greater mission, which in 1939 was to develop horrifying weapons of mass destruction for use against the Chinese population and, presumably, against American and Soviet forces, if the time came. To that end, Unit 731 cycled through tens of thousands of captives across various facilities in Manchuria, which had been occupied by imperial forces for years. The inmates of these facilities were infected with several of the deadliest pathogens known to science, such as Yersinia pestis, which causes bubonic and pneumonic plague, and typhus, which the Japanese hoped would spread from person to person after deployment and depopulate disputed areas. To produce the most lethal strains possible, the doctors monitored patients for the rapid onset of symptoms and swift progression. Victims who survived were shot, but those who fell ill more quickly were bled to death on a morgue table, and their blood was used to transfuse other captives, the sickest of whom would in turn be bled to transfer the most virulent strain to another generation. A member of Unit 731 later recalled that very sick and weakened captives would be placed on the slab so that a line could be inserted into their carotid artery. When most of the blood had been drained and the heart was too weak to pump, a leather-booted officer climbed onto the table and jumped onto the victim's chest with enough force to crush the rib cage, after which another spurt of blood gushed into the container. When the plague bacillus had been cultivated to a degree considered sufficiently lethal, the final generation of victims to be infected was exposed to a large number of fleas, the preferred contagion vector of Y. pestis. The fleas were then packed into powder and sealed inside clay bomb casings. On October 4, 1940, Japanese bombers dropped these capsules, each loaded with 30,000 fleas that had sucked the blood of a dying prisoner, over the Chinese village of Kuzhou. Witnesses of the attack recalled a thin reddish dust settling on surfaces throughout the town, followed by an outbreak of painful flea bites that afflicted nearly everyone. From contemporary reports, it is known that more than 2,000 civilians died of plague following this attack. 1,000 or more died nearby in Yiwu after the plague was carried there by infected railway workers. Other attacks using anthrax killed approximately 6,000 people in the area. A few years later, as the war neared its end, Japan also planned to bomb America with plague-infested fleas, but never got the chance. In August 1945, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed, the Soviet army invaded Manchuria and completely annihilated the Japanese army. The emperor then read his infamous surrender declaration over the radio, after which Unit 731 was officially dissolved. Its records were mostly burned, destroying any useful information the team had managed to generate over 13 years of research. Most of the researchers returned to civilian life in occupied Japan as if nothing had happened, many becoming prominent university faculty members. The list of cruelties seemed endless, and many of the acts committed by members of Unit 731 were even more disturbing than those already described. As World War II neared its end, all prisoners inside the complex were killed to hide evidence, and there were no documented survivors. Tokyo's ministries ordered the destruction of all incriminating materials. Potential witnesses, such as the 300 remaining prisoners, were gassed or poisoned, while the 600 Chinese and Manchu laborers were shot. Ishii ordered all members of the group to disappear and to take the secret to the grave. Cyanide potassium capsules were distributed for use in case any remaining personnel were captured. When World War II ended in September 1945, Ishii was in Japan and was arrested by U.S. authorities, as were some of his accomplices. Astonishingly, Ishii and other members of the unit were granted immunity from war crimes prosecution by the U.S. military government. Other members of Unit 731 were captured by the Soviets when they invaded northern China in the war's final days. Instead of being executed, they were given prison sentences or repatriated to Japan in the 1950s in a Soviet attempt to improve relations with the country. After the war, members of Unit 731 held open reunions in Japan, escaping significant consequences for their crimes. Japan reluctantly acknowledged the unit's existence in the late 1990s, but refused to discuss its activities. Instead, accounts of the unit's operations were built from the testimony of former members, photographs, and documentary evidence. To this day, Japan has not apologized, and China has not forgiven the countless atrocities that Japanese forces inflicted upon China between 1931 and 1945. As the last witnesses of this history age and die, it is possible that the subject will never be addressed again. These forgotten atrocities stand as a grim reminder of how absolute power and an ideology of superiority can lead to brutal and inhuman actions. It is important to remember and learn from these dark events so that they are never repeated. Help us keep this project alive here on YouTube by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, God bless you all, and see you soon.